I'm very happy to present our keynote speaker, who is the first one in this conference. It's Svitlana Matviyenko. She's an associate professor of critical media analysis in the School of Communication and the associate director of the Digital Democracies Institute. Her research and teaching informed by science and technology studies and history of science are focused on information and cyberwar, media and environment, critical infrastructure studies, and postcolonial theory. Matviyenko's current work on nuclear cultures and heritage investigates the practices of nuclear terror, weaponization of pollution, and technogenic catastrophes during the Russian war in Ukraine. Matviyenko is a co-editor of two collections, The Imaginary Up and Lacan and the Posthuman. She's a co-author of Cyberwar and Revolution, Digital Subterfuge in Global Capitalism, a winner of the 2019 Book Award of the Science, Technology and Art in International Relations section of the International Studies Association and of the Canadian Communication Association 2020, Gertrude Robinson Book Prize. I'm passing you mic.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for coming. And it's very important for me to be here and to engage in this very interesting conversation. And I want to thank the team, the organizing team, for putting this event together. And of course, the hosting institution, the Museum of Modern Art, Contemporary Art, sorry. All right. And now, if possible, yes, exactly. Thank you. This talk focuses on the material composition of terror environments as they have emerged during the Russian war in Ukraine. It traces their temporal formation, looking backward to their historical legacies and forward to their anticipated futures, in order to show how these environments proliferate and persist, continually producing subjects of war through terror. Now you're looking at the image that captures the edge of the 21st century terror spectacle. It shows the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear facility in Europe, with 6 active reactors engulfed in flames. This occurred at 11 p.m. on March 3rd, 2022, when a column of Russian heavy military machinery entered the grounds of the plant of the city of Energodar. In the world we live now, this unfolding catastrophe could be watched online in real time through the live streams of various Ukrainian and international nuclear monitoring organizations. Within hours, several international nuclear safety agencies began projecting potential fallout trajectories should the explosion happen, modeling the scope and speed of potential radioactive dispersion. This moment marked a stark convergence between artificial intelligence and nuclear infrastructures in the contemporary theater of war, a convergence that reveals the entanglement of data, visibility, invisibility, the existential risk as defining features of modern warfare. The reporter on the ground, whose updates I followed that horrific night from my home in southwestern Ukraine, was 25-year-old journalist Victoria Roshchina. Her next investigation focused on the expanding system of over 180 secret Russian prisons, black sites, basements, and industrial buildings where civilians are tortured and coerced into false confessions. To access the occupied territories, now reachable only through Russia, she traveled a long and dangerous route, eventually settling in occupied Melitopol. Soon after, she was arrested and transferred to the Taganrog military prison, described as one of the most brutal in Russia's network of detention facilities. She was meant to be exchanged, but instead her father was informed by Russia's military police that she had died on September 19th last year. Her body was returned only 6 months later, in February this year, labeled NM SPAS 757, a Russian abbreviation for unidentified man. Her already mummified body could only be identified through the help of a DNA test, while it bore clear signs of torture: cuts, bruises, a broken rib, electrocution, and the removal of the brain, eyeballs, and part of the trachea, presumably to conceal death by strangulation. Our civilians and soldiers returned dead or alive through such exchanges are not only witnesses of Russia's torture infrastructure, and here on the slide you see some of the most popular tools for torture, gas masks are among them, they are deliberately made into messages of terror, the warnings of what awaits those who resist. Another tool of torture, it's an old telephone, military telephone used for electrocution of people, and this kind of torture usually called a call to Putin. Identity is not something one possesses, but a condition to which one is continuously subjected. In the context of warfare, the apparatuses of subjection include the military infrastructures of filtration camps, detention centers, and torture facilities, what I term terror environments. These are spaces where particular subjects of war are produced for exchange, forced displacement, labor exploitation, or elimination, where the extreme violence not only disrupts material life, but reconfigures the very coordinates of subjectivity. In their most vicious forms, torture infrastructures compel individuals to confess fabricated crimes and issue false statements, forcing them to assume the identities of war criminals in order to be integrated into Russia's prisoners exchange economy. My research focuses on the war in Ukraine, but the logics and logistics I theorize extend across other zones of war, genocide, and occupation, contexts in which identity and subjectivity are violently reinscribed through geopolitical aggression, media infrastructures, and the machinery of warfare. In 2022, together with my doctoral student Daria Hetmanova, a scholar of Russia's settler colonial reconstruction of Mariupol, where the Ukrainian population is being systematically suppressed and dispossessed under a newly imposed military regime, we investigated the infrastructure of so-called filtration camps. Established by the occupying forces, these camps function as entry points into Russia's broader terror infrastructure. Through them, thousands of Ukrainian civilians are deported to Russia, including at least 19,000 children who have been separated from their families and forcibly moved to Russia, subjected to forced re-education, assuming different identities, often reported abuse, illegal adoption, or conscription into militarized youth programs and camps, which are many on Russian territory and the occupied Ukrainian territory now. By tracing such displacement and the following escape of one Ukrainian family out of Russian territory, we uncovered that what can only be described as an industry, the production of transactional bodies. Filtration, we argue, is not a single checkpoint, but a sprawling, prolonged infrastructure. It involves the cross-examination of bodies and digital devices, leading to systematic categorization of people who will be deported, detained, or even executed. These are the gray zones of Russia's so-called special operation, where international law and human rights are suspended, threshold spaces that lead into the necropolitical death world and its terror environment. At the level of logistics and material infrastructure, these environments are administered by individuals who do not merely kill, they appear to take pleasure in committing atrocities. In Ukraine, such acts are sometimes framed through Hannah Arendt's notion of the banality of evil, especially when Russian perpetrators are often quickly identified through the social media accounts where they are good family men posing with their wives and children. However, I'm quite tired and don't accept this identification of any banality of this evil, seeing a lot of systemic events. The Ukrainian documentary, which is called in English Intercepted, and Ukrainian title would be translated as Peaceful People, directed by Oksana Karpovich, confronts this violence head-on. Composed entirely of intercepted phone calls between Russian soldiers and their families, overlaid with images of Ukrainian cities and villages distorted and distorted by war, the film is, in Oksana's words, made out of necessity, just like this research, I would say too. In their conversations, soldiers speak with chilling frankness about torture, executions, and orders to kill civilians. We are told we are entering the area with a lot of civilians, one soldier says to his wife. And we were ordered to kill everyone we see because they might give away our positions. And here is me also exploring similar distorted and broken landscape and architecture in the Chernobyl zone in 2023 after the occupation, where I'm sitting in the office of Biospheric Reserve, which was all broken by the Russian soldiers there. And that's where I also kind of in its methodology, when I was watching Oksana's documentary, I was literally having with this deja vu of this experience walking through this broken and distorted landscape, but also it made me think about my first time of encountering the same intercepted calls, which happened several months after the full-scale invasion began. So when I encountered this archive of intercepted calls, which was made public pretty fast by Ukrainian security services, I couldn't stop listening. I needed to understand the scale of hatred directed at us and all form of violence committed. One recording in particular shocked me so deeply that I wrote about it in my war diary, which was published weekly by Dutch media scholar Gert Lovink on the Institute of Network Cultures blog. So I wanted to share with you this very short clip, but apparently we cannot play the recording, so you will need to trust my description. So if you do not if you do not understand Russian, simply listening to the timbre and rhythm of this brief exchange between two people, young man and young woman, it feels very comforting. You can immediately sense the mutual attraction between these people, a bond, perhaps even a spark of passion. There is an intimacy in the moment they share over the phone. And if And you can see that they really were anticipating this call. Her voice is warm, alluring, seductive, and it lingers in your ear, especially as it blends with her laughter near the end of the conversation. When the audio cuts off just 32 seconds in, you're likely to want to hear it again because it is pleasing. It ends so quickly and so abruptly. But if you know Russian and start paying attention to the words, you will hear the following. Go ahead and rape those Ukrainian women, but don't tell me, got it? She says. I can rape them without telling you, right? He asks. Yes. So I don't know anything, she says, and giggles. Can I? He asks, laughing. Yes, you're allowed, she says, flirtingly. They laugh together. Just use contraception, she asks, and giggles again. Okay, he says. I knew, of course, that war entails killing and torture. But hearing these recordings spoken in the voices of ordinary people from our neighboring country revealed the extreme spectrum of violence unleashed when the laws of war are suspended under the guise of a special operation. This euphemism used in the Russian Federation to mask its war of aggression is paradoxically accurate. It names a war departing from law, accountability, or limits, a descent into a pure war crime enterprise. It was through this realization that I began to think more deeply about terror and the specific environments it produces, emerging in this war through both fast and slow forms of violence, some rooted in deep historical legacies, all unfolding with a complex and proliferating temporality. War, according to one theorist of war, is politics by other means. As a communication scholar, I suggest that war is also communication by other means. Its media ranging from bombs to bodies. To understand how this war communicates, I visualize it as a dual vector model, two intersecting logics aimed at one target. One vector is transimperial, a mode of control disruption designed to recalibrate global dependencies without dismantling the inter-imperial machine. This logic, often denied by my Ukrainian colleagues, is about preserving lines of communication, even though deterrence or proxy, even through deterrence or proxy confrontation. The second vector is colonial imperial, frequently overlooked by my leftist peers, who are often still attached to Soviet anti-imperialist mythologists, myths constructed during some of the most aggressive settler colonial expansions into Siberia in the Arctic. Here, the goal is not negotiation, but erasure, suppression, dispossession, extermination. Communication is not just suspended here in second vector, it is impossible, and it is replaced by terror. And that's what I think maybe it was less clear 3 years ago. But the current situation, first of all, the negotiations of this extremely strange rare earth mineral agreements, but also the end of war, actually demonstrate precisely this model if you look at who is talking to whom and what line of communication reveals as impossible. Clearly, war and terror are intimately related, writes Charles Townshend. The essence of terrorism is surely the negation of combat, It targets the attacked in a way that inhibits or rather prohibits self-defense. Akhil Mehba takes it further. Terror is deployed to impose submission, to expel, or to exterminate. It functions as a political technology, a mode of governance that organizes space, time, and bodies through the perpetual threat or enactment of death. Terror creates what Membe calls zones of uninhabitability, the prison, the camp, the occupied territory, where sovereignty operates outside the law, and where peace becomes the facade of a permanent unseen war, misunderstood by many and sustained within its own liminal environments of terror. This war, like other wars of the 20th and 21st century, is conducted environmentally by territorializing the atmosphere. 2 decades ago, German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk provocatively claimed that the discovery of the environment took place in the trenches of World War I, referring to the deployment of poison gas by France and Germany in 1914. The first large-scale use of chlorine gas occurred a year later, orchestrated by German chemist and Nobel Prize winner Fritz Haber, head of Germany's gas warfare program. Here, you're also looking at an aerial photograph capturing gas drifting across a battlefield, an image that reveals how environmental awareness, then still emergent, became instrumental in the design of the gas warfare. The photograph, taken from above, evokes today's drone vision and visualizes how poison gas was not simply a weapon but a medium of volumetric war. It targeted not only enemy bodies, but the fragile assemblages and bioinfrastructures that sustain life both inside and outside the organism. Although most chemical weapons in World War I were ground deployed via artillery shells and canisters, this image demonstrates how gas warfare expanded the battlefield vertically, transforming a flat, trench-bound conflict into a multi-dimensional battle space. As Canadian scholar Yuriko Furuhata notes in Climatic Media, such technologies, from aviation to gas masks, marked the beginning of a territorial understanding of the atmosphere. Stuart Eldon describes the shift as as a transformation of war from battlefield to battle space, defined by distance, depth, and three-dimensionality, where space becomes a site of dynamic offense and energy capture. Building on this, I turn to 2 iconic cases of terror environments from the current war in Ukraine. First is the Russian occupation of the Chornobyl nuclear power plant and the bombing of the Mariupol drama theater. Both occurred in spring 2022. Both cases, I argue, are not limited to the moment of their attack. They unfold in time, becoming sites where violence is continuously reproduced. In the case of Chernobyl, I trace the violence back into its Soviet past. In the case of Mariupol theater, I follow the aftermath into the future. In both, I rely on material traces to demonstrate how terror environments operate not only in space, but across extended temporalities, shaping lives and landscapes long after or before the event itself. So we will start by speaking about the case of radiation and its transformation from mass medium to elemental medium. On April 26, 1986, during a performance test resulting in a series of explosions at reactor Unit 4, vast quantities of radioactive material of about 50 million curies of radiation, the equivalent of 500 Hiroshima bombs, were released into the atmosphere to become the largest uncontrolled radioactive release ever recorded for any civilian operation. The information about the explosions could have remained hidden, but at this time radiation traveled far west to reveal itself. When at 7 a.m. on April 26, 1,257 kilometers away from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Swedish chemist Cliff Robinson, working at the Forsmark nuclear power plant near Uppsala, was passing through a radiation detector on his return to the workplace after breakfast, a signal went off and the world became aware of the Chernobyl accident. That's how radiation became a mass medium, and they say it made the world global before the internet. French philosopher Paul Virilio models his theory of modern technological accidents on the Chernobyl disaster. The original accident of modernity, which, I can add, reveals the dual purpose of modern technology, blurring the lines between peace and war. Virilio insists that without accidents, one remains unaware of how technology functions. Technology must break to fully reveal itself, or to be fully realized. Without a shipwreck, he argues, the invention of a ship is incomplete. The shipwreck is the futurist invention of this ship, just as the Chernobyl meltdown is an invention of the nuclear power station. Virilio's famous quote. The invention of a nuclear power station, thus, is finalized, if we follow his logic, in 1986. And I'm bringing Virilio here, not because it is always tempting to speculate with him about the logic of technological accidents, but because now I must disagree on one point with this philosopher. I propose that the full realization of the nuclear power station as a representative technology of modernity did not occur in 1986, but in 2022. The full realization of the Chernobyl nuclear power station as a key technology of modernity was not in its accidental meltdown, but in the non-accidental act of nuclear terrorism. It was important for me to learn that Ukrainian radiobiologist Olena Perenyuk, who is also my collaborator in writing a history of Chernobyl science in Ukraine, and her colleague at the National Institute of Nuclear Safety, Katerina Shabanova, define the current occupation of any nuclear power plant in Ukraine as a catastrophe by default. Drawing on the rules and regulations of the International Atomic Energy Agency, they argue that such definition applies to the occupation regardless of whether an explosion occurs. To see that the non-accidental act of nuclear terrorism has an imperial genealogy, we need to treat radiation not only as a mass medium, but also as an elemental medium. And here I'm learning from American environmental media scholar Melody Yu The empire always leaves a permanent trace that can be localized elementally by attending, as she suggests, to the material, relational, and cultural specificity of a particular environment and the kinds of relations and knowledges that particular environment affords. To read this trace, she says, a milieu-specific analysis of the Chernobyl zone considers its elemental composition, spatial distribution of radioactive elements, and the radioactive potency of the deposit that determines the temporal characteristics of such imperial trace. An elemental medium, it is a milieu that determines the physical conditions and events that provide the environment in which someone acts or lives, or broader, a medium of biological life itself, end quote. It shows that there is nothing accidental about the territory of the Chernobyl zone of exclusion, nor was this territory created in 1986 because of the explosion. Apparently, there were many other leaks before that too, but not only that. The Chernobyl zone is a modern nuclear wasteland. And just as other nuclear wastelands, it reveals imperial and colonial legacies embedded in its infrastructures by which they survive and practices they support. These practices, as American historian of colonialism and environment Tracy Brand Voiles argues, are not isolated but systemic. Colonization always transforms its subject territories. She terms this process wastelanding, understood as a rendering an environment pollutable in ways that are both ideational and material. Wastelanding, if you wish, is a manifestation of primary process of exclusion from protection and care. The term that unsurprisingly becomes an official name of the non-accidental territory, the Chernobyl zone of exclusion. Pollution, as Canadian Métis scholar Max Liberion argues, is best understood as the violence of colonial land relations rather than environmental damage. In the Soviet rule in Polissa, where the Chernobyl zone is located, the features of garrison colony are most apparent. As dictionary tells us, a garrison colony is a place in which troops are quartered for defensive or other military purposes in a particular location, originally to guard it. The city of Chernobyl, with the securitized and militarized territory around it, including the city of Pripyat, founded on February 4th, 1970, to serve the future nuclear power plant, was a garrison colony of the Soviet Cold War military-industrial complex on the territory of Ukraine. The radioactive fallout, therefore, was only one part of the Soviet wastelanding machine. As an elemental medium today, it exposes the polluted territory coincides with the zone of securitization and military control installed there after the construction of the Soviet Cold War infrastructure. First, the ballistic rocket detention radar, Duga-1, and the nuclear power plant itself that was producing military-grade plutonium. A garrison settlement was constructed near Duga, where the military and their families lived until the Chernobyl catastrophe, which devastated and then literally erased the traditional way of living on those territories, customs, agricultural techniques, and the unique dialect spoken in Ukrainian Polissa. And with this, I end up with this little case, this one first case, with this visualization of how I see proliferation of this particular terror environment until the moment of the occupation of Chernobyl zone and production of nuclear terror at the moment of the full-scale invasion. So I do think that we have to consider this legacy And specifically, that goes back to the 50s, where this land was determined to be basically pollutable and securitized as well. Again, that liminal space and that zone is rooted right there. And again, catastrophe, Chernobyl catastrophe, and pollution itself and explosion happened much later on only kind of redefined, basically already existing territory. Now we go to another case with which I will end my talk today. And it has to do with environing technologies of terror in Mariupol. One of the largest civilian shelters in Mariupol, the Donetsk Academic Regional Drama Theater, was destroyed by the Russian forces by hitting it with allegedly 2 bombs in the morning of March 16, 2022. The bombing is an ultimate act of terror, but terror proliferated beyond this act by opening space for the occupational forces and their limited possibilities for violence and suppression. Terror is ecological. It penetrates life-sustaining systems during the body's embeddedness in its environment against itself. It sabotages human cybernetics, making bodies sweat when warmth must be preserved, freeze when speed is viral, inhale poisoned air when stillness is safest. Terror hijacks the body's limited self-preservation mechanisms and turns survival into a tactical uncertainty. In 2023, I joined the project by the Center of Spatial Technologies, who interviewed the survivors of the Mariupol drama theater bombing. Together, we framed the attack not just as a single wartime atrocity, but as a, again, production of a terror environment extended in time. A space where violence continues to unfold long time after the explosion itself. So here is a famous picture from image from Maxar, and this illustrates to me how terror environments are I think of terror environments as materialized through solids, liquids, gases, sounds, and signals, but also debris, dust, heat waves, wailing sirens, shock waves, information blackouts. They destabilize subjects not only through direct violence, but by compromising air, sound, space, and time. So here again, we are speaking not about just battlefield itself, but this battle space that was theorized by several scholars that I mentioned before. So what you see on this particular image, a famous one, if you follow the events, it was produced also on March 16th, 2022, just kind of several hours before the bombing. It shows the theater with hundreds sheltering inside, and you also see how the residents of that theater, whose houses were already destroyed and that's why gathered in this famous building of Mariupol. So they wrote the word "дети" in Russian, which means children, in massive letters on the both sides of the theater, precisely scaled for aerial visibility. This act is also their environmental awareness, their knowing of how this battle space looks like, or how it will be seen by a military pilot. And it demonstrates that those inside were not merely victims. They were literally the subjects of war, aware of this visibility, but also aware of potential targeting. And by the way, in those interviews, we learned that people were really unclear about whether they should put that sign there, because at the same time they were not sure. And that's again what this subjectivity that I speak here, it's that split subjectivity, the complete disorientation. They were not sure whether this word would prevent an attack or entice the attack. In the end, the decision was made to actually put this word there, and the attack happened. This is one of the records that one of the survivors gave us, which also shows a kind of, again, multiple vectors of force, right? So materiality of this environment, stereo environment at the moment of bombing. He actually wanted to turn on the light, but suddenly turned on the camera, and that's how this footage was produced. Terrorism in war targets the most defenseless. The absence of a NATO-enforced no-fly zone over Ukraine, despite urgent appeals from Ukrainian officials since the first day of the full-scale invasion, granted Russia the freedom to continue bombing civilian areas. Similarly, Western agreements that restrict Ukraine, or restricted because it changed recently, restricted Ukraine from using long-range weapons on Russian territory, is political and not legal. In fact, it is quite unprecedented that a country was not allowed to reply, to respond to the direct aggression, and was constrained to fight the enemy only on its own territory. This is actually against the laws of wars. And Ukraine, until quite recently, was leading the war in this incredible, unprecedented constraints. Mariupol's vulnerability and the bombing of drama theater must be understood as direct consequences of these politically imposed constraints. And now I want to tell you a little more about what actually happened after the bombing, because that's where exactly this environment proliferates. This is a frame from a video shot locally and posted on local Telegram channels about how, following the bombing, when kind of ruins was cleaned a little bit, people were allowed to come to the square and to receive some food and water. So terror also reorganizes perception. Information is not received in a vacuum, but in a polluted air, within the soundscape of drones and sirens, amid food shortages and flickering power. Russian-controlled territories replace Ukrainian internet providers with Russian state-run ones. Media content becomes inseparable from the processes of distribution of food and water, which also serve, the whole process, this routine also serves as a surveillance routine, as people could only receive food and water if they show passports, which soon would be replaced with the Russian ones. People line up for food while propaganda broadcasts, as you see, these are big trucks, and all trucks have the screens, and propaganda broadcasts there. If you listen to this clip, so this newsreel actually says that Ukraine doesn't exist anymore. It's occupied by Poland, actually, by Poland. Yeah, and people kind of listen to this, but also are given food and water. And with this overlap of these routines, I find particularly interesting and kind of being kind of the part of proliferation of this terror environment and its material composition. So the cleanup continues, and as you see, some cover is put on the destroyed theater at some point, a couple of months later. Ukrainian writers Shevchenko and Gogol placed there, here Pushkin and Tolstoy, kind of demonstrating, you know, the unity, the imaginary unity of two cultures, I guess. And then something else very interesting happened in September. So in March we have the bombing, but in September, like all those routines of food distribution were happening in May and June, and this is already September, where a concert is organized on the ruins of the theater. So it happens on September 10th, 2022, commemorating the city's World War II liberation from Nazi forces, and a kind of with this allusion to another liberation from another Nazi forces half a year earlier, of which people are reminded by the ruins of the theater. So the concert, the players, and everyone who comes and speaks during the concert reminds everyone that Mariupol is now a Russian city. They play Tchaikovsky, some military rhythms, works, and this is a celebration of the return of the identity and deoccupation. And this is very interesting. Also, now you will see kind of several representatives. The man behind was the current mayor of Mariupol. The man who is speaking is a representative of Pushilin from Donetsk Republic, so-called Donetsk Republic, and the woman is a representative of Kremlin. So after this official part, there is, of course, the music, etc. But the most painful in this whole video was to see the audience. And what was extremely educating, extremely revealing about this whole situation was actually another video, and the group of Center for Spatial Technologies reconstructed this video or made an image from this video, which shows a quite questionable, quite paradoxical spatial composition. So you see there on the background the destroyed theater, which is the stage. Then right near the theater, there is a small group of people, the dwellers of Mariupol, who are the primary audience put there to watch the concert. Then that group is surrounded by the line of fences and guards. Then there is a huge space, and there is another fence around it, which you see another audience behind that fence who are watching those who are watching or listening to that concert. And the guards are everywhere there. So with this particular construction, this composition, you could see that this primary audience is produced for media, because also there are lots of Russian media who are filming them, filming people, filming that primary audience to show how they enjoy the concert and this whole event. This is another case of this production, right? So with all these painful layers and histories and visual reminders about bombing and smell and sound and sirens still are going and all of it, and suddenly there is what this practice of a kind of imposing something that they present as new normality. So zooming in the viewers and looking at their faces doesn't bring them closer, really, probably only further due to the increasing opacity of mediation and the enforced narratives running over the footage. The moment it feels like one is learning at least something about how these people live, or what they feel, or maybe what they think, is quite illusional. And as far as you think about it, you really feel something, a new Iron Curtain, and they are behind it. And that's where I also tried to visualize this case of proliferating of this environment. So where we also see an explosion, the bombing, the traumatic event, and how this particular scene is used with all the re-traumatization, with all deliberate reminders of all this pain and loss and desubjectivation and all of it until particular time. It is still being used. We just decided not to follow it anymore. It really felt a little bit, not a little bit, but quite painful and maybe kind of unethical. So that's how what this particular case ends with the concert, and although we know that this proliferation unfolds. With this and other cases like that, I always ask, so where is the catastrophe? Because the question of where is the catastrophe is also the question, whose catastrophe? And with this, I want to finish by bringing you back to this initial image, the image of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station in flames, which is more than just a visual record of the attack. It is the emblem of this war-defining logic, the weaponization of shared infrastructures, environments, and planetary thresholds. Like the bombing of the Mariupol drama theater, the occupation of the nuclear sites such as Chernobyl or Zaporizhzhia marks the war's shift from territorial conquest to environmental terror. These are not isolated events. They are part of a sprawling architecture of destruction that targets not only the bodies, but the conditions of life itself: air, energy, time, communication, perception. The terror environments of this war operate through material traces and spectral afterlives. They burn, echo, and linger. In the smoke over Zaporizhzhia, we see the convergence of warfare, energy, colonialism, and mediated spectacle, an unfolding catastrophe visible in real time, yet continuously misrecognized or ignored. It is here, at the site where nuclear energy meets planetary insecurity, that we are forced to reckon with the war as the most expensive and enduring act of environmental violence in our time. We, the subjects of terror, of and against this war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Svitlana. I didn't think that it will be so emotional for me, but it was really hard to listen again and again. But I think that it's very important to constantly discuss this topic and constantly come back, maybe in context of all the possible conferences. And identity is just one of them, because I think that in the media sphere where we operate, it's very easy to forget how huge the scale of problem is, and that it doesn't end up with the end of the war, or like whatever we can call this result of these negotiations, and like peace and so on. Yeah, but we have no space. And before I will pass the microphone, I mean, I have really a lot of questions, but I was thinking about the previous panel, and how Susanna mentioned that non-harming while when representing others is important. And on the other hand, I'm like, when I'm witnessing what is happening in Ukraine, I'm all the time asking myself a question: how can we be like, how long can we stay not harmful, and how long we can really believe in the fact that it's possible? Because I think that it's a very nice idea not to harm others, and not to be violent, but at some moment, as it happened also with a lot of feminist discussions at the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, we just have to ask ourselves this question: how long can we remain not harmful? And I think that the Belarusian protests very well presented that non-harmfulness is also not something what is working, unfortunately, in extreme conditions. So I wanted to ask you about this issue, and how do you think, like, yeah, how long can we stay not harmful?
Yeah, I think I can respond to your question in this way. I guess it is impossible to speak about war when you are not the subject of war. There is just no way, but no way. And my own language changed when I heard the explosions, when the invasion started. Things changed. But for a long time, because I was in Ukraine at that time and I was caring after my mother who broke the spine, so I couldn't leave. And so suddenly this invasion, and I was observing the whole buildup of forces, reading the intelligence and all sort of things. And I, a war scholar, didn't think it would happen. It was just beyond every rationality. I couldn't understand why Russia could do things to itself in a way, because obviously things changed forever. And the damage was on all sides and stuff like that. So, but then, and that's why I think so this is about language, right? So I really think that war draws with certain lines, and they're horrible, because one day you're a pacifist and then next day you need to volunteer, right? So I always speak about our Ukrainian amazing volunteer and activist, Maxim Butkevich, who was a founder of a very important organization which was called No Borders, working for the refugees' right, protecting Roma people, and all sorts of things. So someone who was known as pacifist and kind of promoting this no border idea. So in the second day of the full-scale invasion, he actually went to protect Ukrainian borders. And that's how, the same word somehow renders a very different positions and mobilizes you to very different act. Even though you don't believe in borders, even you want a kind of certain, right? And then suddenly you go protect them. So, but this particular transition is something I always feel like is missing or misunderstood in most conversations where I participate. War is horrible because it makes you make kind of choices that you couldn't imagine doing before that, and it breaks you. And myself also consider myself pacifist, right? So I don't even know what this word means anymore, actually. But myself, who was extremely bothered by militarization, by something that was kind of building towards the invasion, which I thought would dissolve, but then we are all militarized so bad, and I was kind of keep record of this. So, and then several weeks later, because I was in Ukraine and still teaching Canadian students, giving my own online courses on political economy of communication. And in the mornings, I was giving those lectures. And then after them, I was searching online how to kill. And that is because there was also another intelligence that the invasion could also happen through Transnistria, where Russia has its base. And Transnistria was literally 30 minutes from my town. So the thing was constantly running through my head, what if they enter? So what do I do? I cannot leave my parents. I have to be here. So what do I do? What do I do if they enter my apartment? Maybe I have to have some objects. If I have this object and that object, how am I going to use this object? And that was a kind of thing where I think like something that really broke me. But this particular different activities that were almost simultaneous that I speak about. One thing to Canadian students actually kind of hiding the conditions of my environment not to bother them. And then running through the bomb shelter and out of the bomb shelter. And then also researching on how to kill. Where do I strike with this object or with that object to protect myself if I'm invaded? So, and that's what war is. And I was also lucky that it didn't happen with me. There were many other my close people. Myself, at this point, I lost 17 very close people who were people like you and now had to become soldiers and were killed. So, and that was a kind of, that's how we it's not about harm or not to harm. It's a different thing. It's about what kind of conditions war imposes on someone, right? What it does to you, what kind of language, other language you learn. What do you think about this language? What do you do with this language and with those things after the war is over? I don't have answers to those things. At this point, I only observing extremely kind of dramatic and heavy events that are happening with the whole country, how it's being completely sold at this moment, 19th century type colonization, right? And with me, myself as well, right? So, but of course we shouldn't harm. This is not about harm, right? So this is about protection. But the cost of protection itself, as strange as it sounds, is heavy because suddenly you're crossing lines you couldn't have imagined you can, even if in your mind.
Yeah, thank you. I also wonder, because I totally agree with you, even though I never experienced war, but listening to my colleagues and to all these videos and films about what's happening, I understand that like this is something what I really physically feel that you cannot speak about it or like present it when you didn't experience it. But on the other hand, I think that it's extremely important for people in Ukraine to establish this dialogue with, for example, West. And this gap is becoming more huge and huge because before, like at the very beginning, it was a stress for everyone. Nobody expected this, but now I hear more and more that people in West are bored by this war and talking about it. And on the other hand, people in Ukraine, and not only, but in surrounding countries, radicalize more and more. And this rupture in language becomes more and more visible. And do you have some, because you work in Canada and you present a lot of your research in West, how do you think it's possible to, to find, because we use the same language, we use the same words, but without experiencing things, the meaning of words is totally different. So how do you deal with this?
Okay, yeah, two things. We live in a dangerous moment that totalitarian dictators now know that they can. And there will be more wars. What's happened now with India and Pakistan, what's happened with Yemen, with everything, right? So we see the moment when they know they can. And that's what, of course, there were ongoing wars and genocides prior to not only big-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but even to the beginning of the war, 2014. This war somehow made it more visible in a certain way. It rose more questions for certainly, but also, again, what scares me really is that they now think they can. And the way how Trump assumed this new rhetoric and starting kind of saying statements of aggression with that ease, it was also, and it has been mind-blowing. So, and I think we should take it really seriously, the fact that they learned that they can. Because also, it's not only it's not only the boredom that is a very real thing, it's understandable, it exists. I can tell that even in Ukraine, right? So like people live lives which are kind of convergence of this war and peace, right? So they are going to hair salons and then they run to the bomb shelter and then they go to the funeral and then they go to do nails again and things like this. It's unbelievable, actually. And what I've been observing and also what researching with this particular kind of strangest conversions, right? So it's very interesting. And you can see how people really desperately want to live something like peace themselves. So I completely understand everyone else, and serious things are happening everywhere too, right? To be concerned. But I also think what in addition to the boredom, what is also happening is denial. The denial of the realness of the threat. And I don't want to look as someone paranoid or panicky, but the threat is real. And the military camps for youth that I was talking today, and I also research collaborating with several human rights organizations in Ukraine, they make us ask questions. For what? When 10-year-olds are there. For what? Right? So Russian economy, which is completely military-industrial complex at the moment, right? So if it wasn't for that, it would have been crashed at this point. That's what Russian economists say themselves, right? So the budget was a little more than for 2 years, or 3 years max. So now the country only operates because of the military production. If it stops military production, Russian economy crashes. It cannot afford this. And the scope of Russian military production is more than American, European, and Canadian together. So I don't want, it's very difficult, it's a kind of a scary moment to come to certain conclusions, or I don't want to come to these conclusions. And yet I'm looking at all this and it paralyzes me. And so that's why I feel like, and I understand the denial, right? So because I experienced myself that denial, being a war scholar and still thinking, no, it's not going to happen, it's impossible, it just cannot, etc. So there is a denial, but of course there is a fear, right? So because Europe doesn't have anything to protect itself, and here I am, a pacifist, critics of NATO, of weaponization, of military-industrial complexes, but I'm telling you these things, and I feel horrible just by even saying these words. But these things exist. They are happening. How they will unfold, we do not know. Hopefully, not in the worst way. But I guess we have to be really realists and just question both boredom and denial. And I don't know. That's my just some thoughts on that. Yeah.
You feel maybe horrible, but I feel very thankful for you for doing this. Maybe there are some questions. Yes, I see.
Hello. Thank you for really like analyzing and shedding light on the scale of violence. My heart is pounding throughout the whole presentation. I was wondering, since you are studying this and doing your research and also living it, if there are other terror environments that inform you, or you find some type of camaraderie or a precedent or a contemporary parallel to what you're dealing with.
Thank you for these questions, because there are, and at least I will mention one of them. And with my colleague from Gaza, Palestinian scholar Malaka Shwaich, we are working now on the project about solidarity, thinking through solidarity, thinking about resilience and resistance through Palestine and Ukraine. So we started this project maybe a year ago as a kind of thinking project. But just recently, we did an event in Vienna where we first presented a kind of read certain manifestos of ours about what we think about resilience and resistance, and also why it is important to speak about Palestine and Ukraine together. The cases are extremely different, absolutely. Ukraine is war, Palestine is genocide. But there is also an interesting temporally shifted, kind of shifting resemblance there. And the whole project for me, and I reached out to Malaka because at some point I learned about her fantastic writing about resilience. It's actually called Against Resilience. She wrote it for London Reviews of Books, but also as an academic article somewhere. And she critiques resilience because in her mind, resilience means that you can keep doing violence to me. I'm resilient. And because the same word is also used towards Ukraine, it kind of resonated with me deeply. And I wanted to think about that resistance and resilience together with her. So, and now, when we started our conversation with her, I mentioned someone from Gaza, one refugee from Gaza, mentioned to my colleague in Vancouver that after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that when he sees Ukraine today, he thinks Palestine 1948. And this is a terrible, horrific parallel, right, between these cases, because, and that's why it is already genocide there, not the war. And there is the only way for resistance is indeed prison, hunger resistance. Malaka researches that, right? And in Ukraine, still there is a possibility to fight. And that's why it really bothers me that Ukraine is not forgiven for its ability to fight. It seems like there are many communities, especially among my left friends, who cannot imagine showing any solidarity with someone who fights because somehow it's all in the cloud of war for them. But nobody understands that if war happens to you, then you become that military and you have to find and you have to protect, unless you have another place to run somewhere, but not everybody can, right? So, but this is a thing, this is a parallel for me. It's both colonial, there is different but colonial projects, right? And that's why when I look at Palestine, right, so it actually kind of freezes me inside. And I think more and more about what this, let's say, structural parallel. And yeah.
Sorry. Thank you so much. I was wondering if you would be willing to share more, if there is more, on the kind of detail that you shared in regards to the writing of children outside of the theater. You mentioned that there was some dispute about whether to do that or not. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you have more to share about that deliberation, or related to that, other defensive strategies that are being employed, and are questioning in a similar way this kind of binary between opacity and visibility. And also when you just spoke about resilience, I was thinking about the ways in which something that is made visible is so often considered a sign of resilience, a sign of presence. But then that presence can also, we notice also through like queer theoretical analyses, right, where making oneself visible is also making oneself vulnerable for attack. And so I was really struck by this example that you shared, and if you'd be willing, I would love to hear more. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for asking about this. I don't think I can add more on this particular example because that's what it is, right? So it's precisely, I will probably just continue commenting that this example really illuminated what I mean by subject of war, right? So it's at the same time maybe safe, but maybe becoming a target. And these two simultaneous things, right? So two simultaneous processes is precisely what this rupture, subjective, almost like in Lacanian way, perhaps, right? So rupture is, right? So by, let's say, announcing this presence, by marking, like writing those words, it's precisely those two things happening. And I was very, very struck, right, as I mentioned, because specifically one witness, and I believe you can actually read those interviews. This whole project of bombing Mariupol theater is created as an online website, and if you Google Mariupol Theater Center for Spatial Technologies, so the website will come up. All witnesses, they revealed their identities. These are people who were able to escape from Mariupol because many people could not, right? But many people could. So they were anywhere in Ukraine. And this group, I didn't participate in the interviews. So the interviews were conducted by the team, and they were immersive interviews where they kind of like used something similar to what forensic architecture does, right? So with that crucial difference that forensic architecture is not often works with people and witness, relying just on open available data. But this project is different and very important for me in this regard because it actually relies on witnessing accounts. So witness sat with the interviewers in front of that model of the theater and, you know, told their story, placed the objects, etc., etc. This whole thing is created with the witnesses. They are all there on the website. They want it to be public. And I believe the translation of those texts are there. So you can listen particular, one of them, I think her name is Victoria, who was telling about those negotiations and split of the opinions in this community. And they did call themselves community because all the people lost houses and they accumulated. There were between 500 and 2,000 people there. It was not clear how many were on the moment of the bombing. And the exact number of victims is not only, it also does not exist. Yeah, but she recalled what this particular negotiations, there was passionate negotiation about whether to do this or not to do. But somehow it's interesting how you choose to be visible in the end. And that's a lot to think about, right? So why that choice is made by the subject of violence or subject of war or something like that. Yeah, so that is was indeed quite interesting space. And for me, of course, it was also very important because, again, this aerial view appears again, and we see how clearly, what was striking to me, how they chose the size of the letters so precisely. So the awareness was so precise of what would be visible from the plane, you know. But this awareness, this clear understanding of the scope of this environment was also like really shown in that case.
Thank you. We have time for only one last question. Yeah, so yeah.
Hi, thank you again for this presentation. It was very touching. I have one question, and maybe I was told that war, as you shown, is like a human thing, but it also influences and it's connected with different infrastructures and environments. And you were showing us how war is creating different subjects. And I would like to ask you also about non-human subjects and if there are researchers in Ukraine working on that issue.
Thank you very much. There are, and many. So just on the top of my mind, I mean, there is a Ukrainian environmental network which was designed with a kind of intersection of different groups, agencies, institutions, etc., that monitor things. I work with people from Chornobyl Biospheric Reserve, and they monitor the impacts on life, non-human life everywhere in those areas. But of course, the book of Daria Tsimbaluk has just came out, which is called Ecocide in Ukraine, that focuses specifically on, again, human and non-human in this particular coalition, right? So, and speaks about ecocide. It doesn't really approach the ecocide from, let's say, legal perspective, although it engages with the legal discussion on ecocide and the possibility of introducing it as a fifth crime of war in the international court. But mostly, the way how I read this book, and I also endorsed it, so that's kind of like, and probably even will write something about this book, because for me that book is actually also kind of a witnessing labor, and that witnessing is precisely the witnessing of the destruction of all this human, non-human connection, impact on nature, and things like this. So this is Daria Tsimbaluk, Ecocide in Ukraine, but also there is also Ася Bazdareva, a researcher now based in Vienna, who speaks about landscape as a witness And she develops also kind of a theory of witnessing, a material theory of witnessing that goes beyond human and beyond a kind of like legal discussion of witnessing. But this, yes, there are many other researchers who actually do this work. It's happening. And it is probably only in this presentation I myself didn't touch on that matter, but it's also the subject of my research as well, absolutely. Speak like there is a scholar who also based in Europe, Alexei Kuchansky, who introduced this fantastic notion of geosomatic communities. So he speaks about the harm of the war to geosomatic communities where actually bodies are integrated, right? So human and non-human bodies with the land itself.
I will use my privilege of sitting here and will ask one more question about this project which you are doing with Malaka, because I'm really interested what is the form of it and what is the goal, because what I often hear now from different people and institutions that Gaza is more important than Ukraine because it's like because of a lot of reasons. But when you mention this parallel, it becomes obvious that however it sounds, but there is this possibility of learning and maybe trying to prevent, or I don't know, at least showcasing where are roots and what are results. So maybe you can elaborate and where we can find information about this project.
Yes, thank you. The project is quite in this initial stage, and we just started writing it. So if everything goes well, we hope to finish this short book by the end of the year. The book will be written as a conversation. And this is literally kind of this good friendship and solidarity that we developed. So we want to keep with this mode and absolute like curiosity and support towards each other. And the book will be written as a series of, again, conversations and questions. I will ask her to explain things to me about this and this, and she will ask me also to explain things. We will be explaining things to each other. We will go into difficult questions, right? So at this moment, we are very much probably like the most we developed now for this event that just happened in Vienna, and actually the recording is online. So it's available. It's Institute of Human Sciences, IBM, and if you Google Svitlana Matviyenko Malaka Schweich, IVM, so this recording will pop up. So this talk is there. And for that event, we just developed was this, again, shifted kind of parallel, right? So 1948, 1922. And that's a kind of the most what we kind of done so far, but there are so many questions, new questions that we found for each other. And we want, because we trust each other, we can ask difficult questions. So, but for me, it's a very important project because I am really puzzled and disappointed by this division. I think this division of support should be read psychoanalytically. And then we'll see what we end up, right? So what we understand why and how it is happening, right? So, but again, cases are very different. Genocide is not war, right? So people who want food and need food, medication, and water are in different position when people need weapon. But when people need weapon, it means they still can fight. And that's what, again, I don't understand why the figure of the fighter, who is literally not some kind of, trained soldier, but literally one of you, what I've just taught a course for displaced Ukrainian students, because you're probably aware that there is no education as such in Ukraine anymore for 3 years, right? So the system of education collapsed, right? So Central European University offered this fantastic opportunity and created a program which is called Invisible University for Ukraine. And students who are mostly in Ukraine, but also some of them are somewhere in Europe, can take courses for credit so they continue education, right? Because otherwise they cannot continue education, and not all of them can now like leave the country and enter some other institutions. So this university created this opportunity, which already exists for 3 years. So this spring I was teaching this online course for Ukrainian students, and one of my students in the course was elemental warfare. I engaged with many texts that you heard I brought up in conversation today, and with issues of genocide, ecocide, elemental media, and on and on. And one of my students was taking it from the trenches, a drone operator who still want to read Virgilio and Foucault and Member, and he wants to do it. He cannot stop doing this, even he's still there. But those soldiers are kids, and mostly they are children of my classmates. And I was so surprised by this because I left Ukraine 20 years ago, and I kind of thought that I basically live as a life and interested in different projects. And only in 2016, when I first came to Ukraine and went to Chernobyl, so things kind of started popping up for me, and I realized that the knowledge that I gained through North American universities actually allowed me to see things that I wasn't able to see before. And that's how I got interested in Chernobyl. Not sure why I'm mentioning this, but anyway, so yeah, so because I wasn't in Ukraine for so long time and only came back when bad things happened to my mother, I realized that all my classmates in my small hometown actually have kids whom I remember when they were just born, I left Ukraine. And now all of these kids are soldiers. And I realized that my distance from my country is measured by the life of these kids, literally. And that was one of the most striking things that I learned actually with a full-scale invasion. So they're kids, they were not supposed to be there. They don't want to do that. They have to as artists, writers, whatnot. So, and yet we are not forgiven for fighting, even though this fighting is done at this unimaginable cost and loss and things like that.
Thank you very much, Svitlana, for sharing your knowledge and for I think making us more and more aware, but also I would like to thank you especially for bringing all these names of researchers, journalists who are fortunately alive or who were killed, because I think that this is something what we really need to dig into when speaking about all these issues and thinking that we have right to speak or like to express our opinions. So yeah, thank you very much.